to Optima's EPL Bite-Sized Learning for April 2021. I'm Millie Mastromati with Optima, and I'm excited for our topic today, which we will be discussing with Eric Glassman. Hi, Eric.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, thanks. You're doing well?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, hopefully you have seen some of our previous Bite-Sized Learning recordings with Eric, but if not, as a very short introduction, Eric is an attorney with Shaw Law Group with extensive legal experience, and you can find out more about him and Shaw Law Group at shawlawgroup.com. That link is on the same page where you found this recording. Today's topic is documentation. Make it your mantra. Eric, I love talking about documentation. I know that I'm probably the only person in the world, but it does seem like it's the core of all risk mitigation, period, but especially for employment practices. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. You and I love it given what we do for a living because we see problems arise in the rear view mirror, right? That is usually you and I are called in after there's a problem, and we love seeing documentation, right? Because it's the guidepost to helping us establish what the heck happened and what we do about it. Yep.
Right. Okay, so let's start by clarifying when managers and supervisors should even think about documenting something in their employee file.
Well, first of all, let's define our terms by employee file because that means different things to different people. Let's differentiate a formal personnel file from what I call a drop file. A formal personnel file is usually maintained by the HR folks, and they're usually very strict as to what goes into that personnel file. Application, copies of annual performance evaluations, any formal discipline taken against an employee, those sorts of things. I don't think that's what we're talking about today. That is, HR owns the personnel file, and for a very good reason. HR is pretty conservative as to what goes in that personnel file because if a question arises, we want to make sure that there's just the right stuff there. Instead, with documentation, particularly on a supervisor manager level, I'm thinking more of a drop file, which in the old days, and for some of you, depending on how you do things, might still be a physical file. A physical manila file, hopefully locked in your individual workspace for each one of your employees. If you're not doing this yet, I hope that each of you develop a system for documenting interactions with employees. Right? Again, in the old days, and for many of us, it remains a physical file. I jot down a note. I just had a conversation about Cindy about this or that. I put it in that physical file. Maybe once a year or so, I go through and I weed out the older entries. But I'm trying to keep an ongoing set of notes as to interactions that I had. Others of you fully electronic. My big mantra with documentation, find a system that makes sense for you. You're going to be guided by your HR folks, but for instance, I sometimes see people do documentation in Excel spreadsheets. Totally fine with me. Oftentimes people use Outlook emails. That is, they email themselves a note that just had a conversation with Bob about such and such on April 1st. And then I obviously in my Outlook, I have a specific electronic file per my employees. But we want to document interactions with employees, certainly about performance, either good or bad. I just had a conversation with John that he needs to do better in completing this or that report. about related issues having to do with the workplace. For instance, attendance issues. I just had my fourth conversation with Maria about arriving to work on time. Really important to document that sort of stuff. Or I just had to have a conversation with Mary about a negative interaction that she had with a patient or with a client, right? This is how I'm asking Mary to handle in the future. Anything out of the ordinary, anytime when you've had a sit down or stand up with the employee in which you're asking them to improve, or very importantly, you're praising them for what they did. The beauty of keeping a drop file is that's going to be the basis for you to create that annual performance evaluation. Obviously, other various employers do it at different times and do it at different means, but I suspect all of you are being asked to evaluate your employees. It's so much easier to do if you have a written record of this documentation, right? Include the good things, because I don't know about all of you, but at least during the pandemic, I couldn't keep anything straight, right? I can't remember what happened, 3 weeks ago, much less 3 months ago. By keeping a written record, it's going to make your life so much easier.
And so who has access to that drop file? Is anything in there like legally discoverable or?
Wonderful question. Assume that any documentation you make about an employee or your workplace is conceivably discoverable. Right? As a frontline matter, we're not going to willy-nilly turn over drop files to employees. But for instance, worse comes to worse and there's a lawsuit, right? And there's a subpoena issued. What you put in that drop file might very well be turned over to that employee. So with all documentation, you want to be careful as to how you document, right? You don't want to be embarrassed later that you, had the equivalent of a temper tantrum in a note that you wrote. That employee, they just can't get it. They're the slowest employee that I ever met. That might come back to embarrass you. Keep it professional.
Objective, not
objective.
That type of thing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, what's worse, no documentation, vague documentation, or overly verbose documentation?
Let me turn off my phone here for a second. Sorry about that. Okay, so my choice is you've given me a let's make a deal choice between no documentation, vague documentation, and overly verbose.
Yeah, right.
Are those my choices? Blech. I hate those choices. All of them are bad. No documentation. Boy, if trouble arises, you're really setting yourself up for trouble by not documenting interactions with an employee that might come back to bite you. Because an employee comes back a couple of years later and says, boss never trained me on this. Boss never told me that I had a performance issue. Or worse, boss called me a such and such, right? If you don't have any notes, it's at least implicitly, maybe in a jury's mind, it's going to lead to the implication that maybe what that employee is saying is true because you don't have any way to defend yourself. No documentation is really bad. Vague documentation, I guess it's better than no documentation, but there's certainly some pitfalls to just making vague platitudes about folks that we can talk about if you wish to. What's the problem with too much documentation? You might think that's a wonderful thing. In retrospect, if you're documenting every single interaction that you had with somebody, just routine stuff, it begins to look like maybe you're targeting that person, right? I'm especially if we compare the level of documentation that you do for Jill as compared to what you documented for Larry, right? Why so much information about Jill? Do you have something against Jill? Are you micromanaging Jill? There's that sweet spot with all things managerial. It's trying to figure out what's enough and what's not too much.
Okay. So, the next question was describing the pitfalls of vague documentation, but do you think you covered that, or did you have any more comments about it?
Can I put in a pitch for performance evaluations? What I often find, particularly if we're tasked to do a number of performance evaluations on a deadline, that is, by December 31st, I've got to do performance evaluations for 13 staff members. We tend to be very vague because it's easy for us. It's not particularly helpful, though. We use kind of vague platitudes like employee is fine. Performance is much like it was last year. It's just not useful. It's not useful for the employee who's looking for some feedback. I often find employees really look forward to evaluations, right? It's their time to actually shine, to get some feedback, to figure out what they can do doing better. In a vague document like that doesn't help them. It also helps the organization improve, right? There's always something that, a specific that we can give an employee to help them improve, or some praise that we can give them to try to encourage them to do more of it. I always get concerned when I see a supervisor or manager who is just kind of giving everybody a review that's just kind of right smack in the middle without any specifics. Call them as you see them, obviously in a professional, objective, thoughtful way. But if you're going to document, do it right.
Right. And so what do you feel about, going, say, on Google and Googling a bunch of adjectives, and these are the adjectives I'm going to use this year?
It sounds awful the way that you say it, Billy. I mean, I'm all for trying to improve the richness of performance evaluations. Meaningless adjectives. How is that helpful to anybody? I mean,
Right.
Aren't you sick of certain words? They get used over and over again. My big word for at least 2020 as we came out of it was the word pivot, right? We're all encouraging our workplaces to pivot, for employees to pivot. Black. Are there other genuine ways to communicate feedback for employees? We're not just using buzzwords.
Okay, so to close out the question and the conversation, aside from not documenting enough, what are the most common documentation pitfalls supervisors and managers make that create challenges if litigation ensues?
Couple of ideas here. One is not doing it in a contemporaneous way. That is, if you're going to make Stealing Millie's title documentation your mantra, do it now. It doesn't have to be fancy, right? Again, if you're the type of person that likes to scribble on legal pads notes, as a lawyer, I'm totally fine with that. But try to do it somewhat in real time. right? I'm not a big believer if you're having a one-on-one conversation, you should be writing notes during the meeting necessarily, at least extensive notes. That's kind of rude. But right after that meeting, you just, you take the 5 minutes to type up a paragraph as to what occurred. Sometimes in litigation, I've been given by a supervisor or a manager really extensive notes of conversations with employees that maybe gone back a couple of years. I look at the notes, I say, wow, that's wonderful. I'm really going to be able to defend you well there. When did you write the notes? Oh, I wrote them last night in preparation for our meeting. It's not really helpful for us, to do it, a month or several years later. Do it now if you can. I know documentation is no one's favorite. If you do it now, it's going to make your life so much easier. Other pitfalls, not saving your notes. You can't access your notes. You can't find them, right? Whatever method you're using is a way that you're not going to be able to come up with them later on. Litigation. In states like California, statute of limitations have been extended. That is, employees who, for instance, have a harassment complaint have a longer time to bring a lawsuit than they previously did, which means documentation is ever more important, right? Are you going to be able to find those notes that you maybe took 2 or 3 years ago? Other problems I see, or I guess put it more positively, helpful tips. Please do make sure your notes are professional and objective. Try to avoid inappropriate comments and try to avoid using legal terms, right? She was a bully. He harassed her. He exposed her to a hostile work environment. Are sometimes notes that people, or sometimes words that people put in their notes, not really understanding the legal ramifications of those words. Each of those words that I use, bullying, harassment, hostile work environment, means something under the law. And my concern is when we start trying to document like a lawyer, if those notes, heaven forbid, ever make their way into a lawsuit, someone's going to use those words against us. Hey, you said that he harassed her. You should have done something about it, Ms. Supervisor, that sort of thing, right? So try to speak like a human being, not like a lawyer. Try to keep the emotion out of it.
Okay, and I was thinking while you were bringing that up, say you're my supervisor and I come to you with a sheet of paper and I say, I want this put in my employee file. I'm really upset about this, such and such problem. What do you do with that piece of paper that an employee gives you? Do you put it in the drop file or where do you put it?
First of all, I've got to figure out if there's any other action that needs to be taken in response to that piece of paper. But it's simply they're trying to memorialize something and it's coming from the employee. I'm always going to consult with the HR people as to what I should do with it. I doubt very much it's going to make its way into the formal personnel file. It might go into my drop file. A proper response, frankly, might be, why don't you keep the piece of paper, right? In case you ever need to reference it. That is, as a supervisor or manager, I pretty much want that drop file to be my own documentation, not somebody else's. All right. But as with everything HR, if you got a question as to how to handle it, pick up the phone, use those HR people as a resource.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Well, I think we covered most of it. Did you have any closing comments or anything?
Nope. Thank you all.
Okay.
Documenting really is one of the most important things that you can do to protect employees and frankly, to protect your own reputations.
All right. Make it your mantra. Thanks, Eric, for your insight. And I hope this recording is helpful to all of our viewers. Let us know how we did on the evaluation that's on the webpage, that you got the recording. And goodbye, everyone.